How are you guys doing?
Great.
Are we energized? I know it's after lunch, but guys, we've got work to do. We've got work to do. So I hope you are all feeling as energized. I hope you have felt some new personal connections during your time here together. I'm really excited about this panel, but I want to tell you why I'm really excited, and then I'm going to turn it over to literally the master of ceremonies, my friend Raj. I'm really excited about this panel because we started this morning with Iris really framing in a powerful way what the literature, what the evidence shows and says as we think about where we are today. We then went to the first panel that really talked about what's already working. Like, let's not always just talk about the problems. Let's talk about what we know, what works, and figure out how to bring that to where we are, right? Then we started talking about, well, where are we getting stuck at the political levels? But even there, where have we made a lot of progress? We then connected to what's working at local levels in places like Uganda, and how can we take that to scale? What we're going to do right now is really talk about where are we still a little bit stuck, but you can't also fix problems if you don't think there's a problem. So what are the hidden barriers? We're talking about breaking barriers. You can't break barriers that you don't know that exist. So we have one of the most powerhouse panels here. I'm going to let Raj take over and be really excited. I want to just say a quick word as I turn over to Raj to just say, and I know, Raj, you may be saying this, but just say, Raj used to be one of ours here at the Kennedy School. He left the Kennedy School to do what he's doing today, which is he is literally in the international development sector. What he has created with Devex is one of the leading platforms in news, information, media to actually bring frontline voices of what's happening in international development in a critical, thoughtful, provocative way to all of us. He's been on a, 20-year journey plus, Raj, to do this. He is a trailblazer in what he's been able to do, and he's still got another 50 years to go. I hope I can be on his journey with him as he does that. Raj, over to you. Thank you for being back here at the Kennedy School.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Fatima. And thank you, all of you. Fatima asked if we're feeling energized. Are you feeling energized? Yeah? I'm feeling really energized, too. I have to say, last night's dinner, the conversations today, you get a real sense of community. The other feeling I've got is nostalgia. As Fatima mentioned, this is where Devex got started. It was actually 24 years ago. We're about to celebrate our 25th anniversary. Yeah. The Kennedy School was a really important place to me. I met my wife here on the very first day of school, standing in line, registering for classes. I got to meet some friends, and together we cooked up Devex. And we had this idea that global development really needed to aspire to something more, that we had to get out of our little silos and out of our government contracting mindsets and sort of think big. And I think we've tried to do that by elevating voices like the ones you're going to hear on this panel and so many of you who are here in this room. The other thing I feel nostalgic about is my grandmothers. After all the conversation about grandmothers today and last evening, it's such an honor to be with you. So very quickly, if you'll indulge me, two things about my grandmothers. One, my grandmother in South India in Kerala was married at 13 years old. But she was a powerhouse, an absolute leader in our family, a really matriarch of the family. And my grandmother in the US, in New Jersey, back in the 1950s, young men did something called drag racing. I know this is an international crowd, but you're probably familiar with this idea, and it still goes on today all over the place. And unfortunately for her, they were drag racing, and she got in an accident, a car accident at the time. In the 50s, she ended up in a coma. She was in the hospital for a while. She was always very fiery, especially for a woman in the 1950s. But when she came out of that coma, she was particularly fiery. And she had no patience anymore. And I think she would have fit right into this room because she came at these issues and said, what are we waiting for? And just one little vignette about her that my mom likes to tell. They were driving in the South in the US. Again, you know the era, the 1950s, the era of segregation. They went to a rest stop on the highway, and there was a bathroom that said whites only and another bathroom that said colored people only. And she got so mad that she literally ripped the signs down, opened the trunk of her car, threw them in, and drove off. And I don't know if that's what Fatima was asking for when she asked us to take action. But I think that spirit of impatience that I got from my grandmother, and I'm sure you may have gotten from yours, is a lot of what we are really driving for today as we think of what is this next frontier, right? Because the truth is there's a lot of great things that have happened. Many of you are the leaders behind it. You're going to hear from this incredible panel. But yet there is a lot of backlash to the progress in this room. There are a lot of people who do not agree with what we're talking about. There are people who are actively plotting and planning against what we are talking about in this conference. And the truth is, it's not an easy fight. So we want to talk about the context and how it's shifted and what we actually do about that. Let me just mention who I have here before we dive into that discussion. So Bineta Diop, Madame Bineta Diop, is probably known to many of you. She's the Special Envoy for Women, Peace, and Security in the African Union. She's based in Addis, but really you're all over the continent working on these issues. Next to her is Janet Pao, who's the Executive Director of the Asia Business Council. So someone who works a lot with the biggest CEOs in the world and the biggest market in the world. Next to her is Mia Perdomo. Sorry, I can't read my own handwriting, Mia. And Mia is the CEO of Equalis. Equalis, well, we're going to hear more about it, but you are a phenomenal entrepreneur, social entrepreneur in Colombia and across the region of Latin America, driving for exactly the issues we're talking about today. And then Dorothy Estrada Tank is with us, and she is the chair of the UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls, among many other hats that you wear. So this is an incredible panel to get into, I think, some of the elements of the context, right? What's different now? What's different going forward? Climate change, conflict, those are different, and they're affecting this issue of gender equality in a very big way. A whole new economy is being developed in front of us, right? A digital economy, an AI economy, and where women fit into that is a key issue we have to look at going forward. So we're going to get into both of those topics. We're going to talk about the backlash. So I want to start with you, Dorothy, about this broad, the political narrative that we're all living in, because as I say, we might agree in this room, but I'm not sure this is representative of the reality in the countries represented on the stage today. How do you see this moment of backlash that we're experiencing?
Thank you so much, Raj. Before going directly into the backlash, I'd just like to give a bit of context of what the UN Working Group is. So we're one of the special procedures of the Human Rights Council. So we're part of the international system for the protection of human rights. We're a group of 5 special rapporteurs, each one from one region of the world. And the work we do is pro bono. So we have our normal everyday jobs, and we do this work to uphold the values of the UN Charter and UN international human rights instruments. So this is to say that we are UN in that sense, but we are not UN insofar as we are not UN staff or paid by the UN. So everything I'm going to say is in that line of what we are mandated to do as independent experts of these special procedures. And in 2018, the working group identified preoccupying trends of rollbacks, of the gender backlash, and published this report sounding the voice of alarm for the Human Rights Council, saying we are seeing these patterns in different parts of the world, not only in authoritarian countries, but also in otherwise democratic countries. We see trends of fundamentalist movements, extreme right-wing movements, movements that instrumentalize religions, and different cultural values interpreted in certain ways to say that gender equality is so-called gender ideology, that gender equality is not a human right, when
even the word gender has become politicized now, right?
Some of the indicators are precisely questioning the concept of gender, questioning gender-based discrimination and violence. So you see a tendency to change the name of ministries of equality or gender equality to ministries of the family with a certain heteronormative, sometimes patriarchal understanding of the family. You see a tendency to take steps back in the protection of sexual and reproductive health rights. Does that sound familiar? So this is 2018 when we identified it, and we've seen it unfold and worsen in different countries. At the same time, there's resistance. The women's movements are resisting, but we have to come together and unite more. And we see that in countries where there was already legislation or policies in place protecting gender equality, how there are steps back. Again, in sexual and reproductive health rights, in, for instance, proposals to reverse the ban on female genital mutilation. And all that obviously affects women and girls. It also affects people of the LGBTIQ plus community, right? So you see these strange alliances between the far right and then even some feminist movements of, in some cases, older women that do not accept, for instance, trans rights. So it's very difficult sometimes to build alliances to really counter the gender backlash effectively. And here I'm thinking of what Eliana was saying in the first panel of trying to recover and remember why we're doing this, that we're doing this on the basis of human dignity, which is the foundational cornerstone of all international human rights instruments, regardless of gender, but at the same time taking into account gender and those identities and intersectional forms of discrimination, because again, it's women and girls that suffer, also people from other marginalized communities, but also within those, some that suffer the most. Undocumented migrant women, asylum seekers, refugee women, women from sexual or gendered minorities. And so we have to build the gendered lens, but also the intersectional lens into that, and try to build synergies between movements, I think. You were speaking before of climate change and all the efforts to combat that. So let's bring part of that community to the gender equality discussion. The movements to build socioeconomic equality. So not only to combat poverty and tackle those at the bottom, but also the gaps between those in poverty and those at the top, and the structural issues that Prime Minister Al-Razaz was talking about. Debt relief, structuring trade in different manners, the law that governs these economic decisions and institutions. So there's work to do.
I want to come back to some of those economic questions because it's very often, I think, and maybe conferences like this have been like this in the past, where economists think of the macroeconomy and where you tweak the macroeconomy to drive employment, to increase production, but maybe never uttering the idea of gender equality, you know, in that sentence. And I think that's one of the important markers of this event, is sort of flip that idea on its head and say ultimately gender equality is the driver here of all of the things we want to see, including around economic growth. So we're going to come back there, but I want to bring Bineta into the discussion as we work on this context, as we get started. The context where you work, much of it now is climate stress. It is conflict. And you are very well known in your community and around the world as a peace builder, as someone who's worked with women and girls to be agents of peace, not just to be seen as victims of conflict. Tell us about the context you're working in right now.
Thank you, Raj. But let me first say, as a grandmother who have 2 children, but 7 biological, but 7 others that I have adopted. So I have, like you, and I recognize your work and salute you, grandmother. So, Raj, the context in Africa, you know, it's 54 countries. And sometimes the narrative is that we are all the time in conflict. You don't hear anything else that conflict in Africa. And women victims, the other narrative, being raped, and the body of the women being used as a weapon of war. That's the reality as well. And that's the narrative that you get. But there is another narrative that we need to, the resilient. Those that are the one that make Africa that we know, the Africa we want to see. The Africa with resources, with the people, with the youth, with the brilliant, you know, the women that you find when you go underground. So that's the Africa that we're talking about. But the environment is still, as you said, we have this triple C right now. We have the COVID-19, the lockdown. We know the violence, not just in Africa, it was everywhere. Violence against women was everywhere with the lockdown. That's the one reality. On top of the rape, we have the other thing, which is the climate change. You go to the Sahel, but you find women who are fetching wood being raped on the road or going to fetch water. That's the other thing. The third one is the conflict, and you can take it, the one, for example, in Ukraine, And when you look at the Ukraine war, somebody talk about feeding our people, but we know that it was impacting on the Africa economy, on our agriculture, the fertilizer that we could not get. COVID, we could not get the protection and so on. So Tripoli are impacted with our conflict. So women suffer, but they are the backbone of the society. That's the reality. They are the one that wake up like grandmother and who is trying to make sure that she's transforming the life of her community. So that's what we are doing. Here I am, of course, not representing the African Union, but being a mandate as a special envoy on women, peace, and security. And when I enter in the terrain, in 1995, with Madame Bisi, who is here, we were in Beijing, we came back, and all of us excited to say we want to do something. Africa have to take the leadership in the transformation of our continent. So I created a foundation, Femme Afrique Solidarité. We said, for me, what was important is to look into the crisis that we see in the Liberia, in Sierra Leone, in Somalia, in Sudan, South Sudan, you name them. All where women, you see them suffering, but silent suffering and the need to support them. So I engage myself in this transformation for the women to be the active change in their society, and they are. You could see it, refugee today, tomorrow they are. The First Lady of Sierra Leone yesterday said she was refugee. She fled the country, went to UK. But you could see now how she's transforming her own country. That's the model that you could see, and many. You can talk about Ellen Johnson Sirleaf in 1996, when I went to Liberia and continued to be with her. I said, Madam, what do you want to do in this country that is torn apart? You can't see a road, you can't see nothing. She said, I wanted to construct this country. I'm going to lead in the construct. And you can go now in Liberia. The peace that you can find in a country is thanks to the leadership of that woman. So there are many Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. So now maybe something that have been discussed this morning, engaging men, which is very important. For us, we started by looking to say we are talking to ourselves all the time. And it's good. It's good to have a room full of women, leaders, to have our common, to disagree sometimes, and at the end to agree. But to say in the conversation, how do we make sure that the men are there to transform? Because we cannot do it alone, because it's a societal issue. So we have put what we call the positive masculinity in Africa. We call it the transformation with men and women in the society, including religious leaders, traditional, because when you talk about female genital mutilation, if you wanted to change the mindset, you need to go down there. And where you find those who are the gatekeepers, which is our traditional and sometimes our religious leaders, but also private sectors. In the mindset, I'm sure that my colleague will talk about private sector engaging in the gender agenda as well, but also the young boys that need to be engaged at the early age. So we have that positive masculinity, and sometimes we say you need to start the bottom up. But in Africa, we say sometimes it's political will is important. You need to have the legal, today we talk about policy, we put in place policy, but we need more also the engagement of the leaders of our continent. So we engage with head of state, more than 10 of them, to say we need this agenda. For example, we are working on a convention against violence against women with 10 head of state in Africa. And this is something that, for the protection. This morning we say that we need the network, the agency for women. We need the policy. When I started in the African Union, there was only 17 countries that have National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security. The first one being Cote d'Ivoire, 17. Our work, our mobilization, now we have 35 countries. Not enough, not enough. It's good to have a policy, but it's the implementation, the action. So what I did with other women is to have what we call a continental result framework with indicators. We negotiate. Women knows how to negotiate. We negotiate with our member state to say, listen, you have the actions, but we need to make sure that you get indicators because you're going to implement and you are going to see your economic growth if you implement. So we bargain through the economic and the development agenda. And we were able to get the framework to measure progress. So we have the accountability with our member state right now. And certainly I will come back to it when we talk about women in negotiation, in peace process, and the peace accord. Thank you, Raj.
Thank you, thank you. And I just want to pull out a couple of threads. Please applaud, please. I just want to pull out a couple of threads we've heard already from Dorothy and Bineta. One is this idea that narrative really matters. Even the language matters, right? The way you call a ministry. You talked about African women being resilient as opposed to being victims. So we've already started to think about how do we frame these issues? And I think that's important, certainly as a journalist and coming through the lens of Devex, we think a lot about that. How are we reporting on these topics? And are we being just to the people we're reporting about in the way we frame them? And then the other, I think, thread that's come out is who are we engaging? Are we engaging religious leaders? Are we engaging local leaders? Are we engaging men and boys, political leaders, right? So I just want to keep in mind those threads as we continue the discussion. And Janet, certainly in your role, you are engaging a lot of male leaders, right? Because you're running this business council in Asia, some of the biggest companies in the world, and many of the CEOs are men. But you are thinking about this issue of narrative. You're framing for them an opportunity around women's workforce participation. Not just a deficit, which might be a very real thing, but an opportunity. Talk to us a little bit about how you frame it and how business leaders in Asia are engaging.
Sure. Thanks, Raj. Very kind introduction. And I think what struck me is that all four of us in our different realms are actually engaging across the region, our own regions. So not just our own countries, but we're sort of looking across and trying to find common solutions. So I'm incredibly humbled to be on this panel. And so just a little bit of context. So I'm the executive director of the Asia Business Council. Our members are business leaders who run some of the large companies all around Asia. So many of them are in developing Asia. So from Indonesia to Malaysia to India to China, basically all the major Asian economies are represented. And what we do talk about is that we talk about how to ensure the region can continue to grow and prosper, and that the growth is inclusive and that it's sustainable. So one of the very interesting things, just hearing from a lot of the speakers over the past day is that for Asia, a lot of these economies that I work in are middle income. So in a way they're developing, but they go from, they're countries that range from about $3,000 US GDP per capita to around 9,000. So a lot of the economies are like that. So in a way, these are fast-growing economies. They're drivers of global growth. You hear on the news every day that they are doing very well. So I think that a lot of the developing countries actually looking to Asia and saying, what is Asia doing right? And Asia is doing a lot of things right. For instance, poverty alleviation, while it is still a big issue in many of the countries, that is not right now the center of the discussions in private sector. What we talk about a lot is how to ensure economic participation of men and women, inclusive of everyone, and making sure everyone is empowered to have good livelihoods while solving these issues like climate change and technological change and the fragmentation of global trade and investment. So as many of you know, Asia is export-oriented economy, and actually a lot of the export-oriented manufacturing jobs are done by women. And right now, the fragmentation and protectionist tendencies of some of the economies is actually closing the opportunities, employment opportunities for women. So that is something that I think a lot about, and we have a dialogue constantly among the different country leaders to see what we can do to continue to facilitate trade and investment, while countries are trying to localize jobs and ensuring people get employed. The other thing...
Take us into that discussion, if you would, just for a second, the conversation you have with political and business leaders, because the workforce participation numbers for women haven't improved much in Asia, even though education outcomes have improved a lot.
Yeah,
what is going on there?
Yeah, so I think when we talk about education of girls and women, I think in many of the countries that you represent, that is a really big issue, still a huge gender gap. In Asia, across developing Asia, the gender gap of literacy and numeracy has actually narrowed a lot. And probably the laggard is South Asian countries, but for a lot of the other developing Asian economies, that education gap has closed. And there is a reverse gender gap, in fact, of tertiary enrollment, with more girls, more women that are tertiary graduates than men. However, as Raj, you were mentioning, the workforce participation of women have, in many economies, barely budged in the past 20 to 30 years, which is an extreme surprise to myself when I look at the numbers, because seems like Asia is growing and seems like everyone is prospering. But why is women workforce participation still so low? I mean, the highest one is Vietnam and Thailand, right? Those are the countries that have a history of women empowerment and participation, but still, it's never going above 50-some%. Part of it, I think many of the speakers have addressed, could be social norms, and again, Asia is very diverse, so some of the cultural norms have to do with Confucian beliefs, some of the cultural norms have to do with other kinds of traditional beliefs, and what's really interesting is that that really leads to underemployment of women, which is, I think, not talked about enough. I was recently in Jakarta and talking to a man who is a pretty senior lawyer. He's in his mid-30s to 40s, and he asked me the question. He said, I don't understand, Janet. Around Asia, it seems like women's well-being is going up. Many of my classmates in college and in law school are women, but suddenly, when I get to partner level, all the women are gone. Where are they? So, I think it's multifaceted. It's, again, different for different countries. But, I think some of the cultural norms and some of the, things that we have talked about in terms of family obligations, unpaid work, the lack of couple equity, which, Claudia Golden has talked a lot about. I mean, that also still applies to Asia. So that's a common issue across different countries.
Let's try to answer that question of where are the women at these more senior levels, at least in Latin America, because Mia, you may have the answer to this. Mia, you built this incredible company helping companies to understand how they can get to gender equality and really ranking them and analyzing the results. Tell us a little bit about the work you're doing, but then to explain to us, how do we understand where companies are failing? Why is it that you see young women joining at the early ranks of a business and then they're just not appearing in the senior ranks?
Thank you, Raj, and thank you, Harvard, for this invitation. I'm thrilled to be here. I want to comment on everything.
Great, please do.
So I'm going to start from the beginning. Equalis is a company that we created in Latin America because companies were not thinking about gender equality and diversity, at least not formally. And so we basically set the agenda for gender equality in the corporate world. In Latin America, we started in Peru and Colombia. My co-founder is Peruvian. And we created a ranking that measures corporations in terms of their conditions on gender equality and diversity, gives them a free report, and then we have an awards event, which we like to call the Gender Equality Oscars. And then the corporations are eager to participate and to get better every year and to compete against their competitors in the market. And that's how we started a movement of corporations that now amount to 2,000 corporations in 18 countries that have measured themselves every year with Equalis' measurement. We've seen so many things in the past 10 years, and we understand now that corporations are failing in many ways. Corporations are not understanding the holistic environment of women's livelihoods. So, of course, this conversation cannot be divided from the conversation of care work. Because the reason why women are not partners in law firms, and let me just say that law firms are our hardest clients, not mining or oil companies, it's law firms. The reason why they're not partners is because they get lost along the way, not because they don't want to be partners, but because it's impossible to balance the care work that they have with their professional jobs. And everyone knows this, but the system is not changing. If you have to charge per hour, and the only reason you get to be a partner is because you charge more hours than the man on your right, then you will not be able to charge as many hours because you need those hours to take care of your kids, even in Latin America where we hire care work. And we're very lucky and unlucky, and that it's a controversial conversation, but we are lucky enough to hire that work, but then the women we are hiring to take care of our children in our house are leaving their children unattended. Thankfully, now we have people like Claudia Lopez doing this for Bogota, and now we have care work, these things are happening. So what are corporations failing at? The system that they are creating is an androcentric system where men go to work, they spend 10 hours, and then they go back home, and that's it for them. But the system that we live in today is multiple chores, everything happening at the same time. You need to bring your kids to school, you bring them to the doctor, you check out what's happening for lunch, then you bring the present for somebody's birthday, then you create an event for whoever's birthday is at the office. We do the care work at home, we do the care work at the office. And corporations need to understand that this is their business as well. And so Equalis works with them, yes, in terms of how do we bring barriers down in policies, practices, and statistics. And we do this by showing them why they're doing things wrong. They don't know, they don't have enough information. Now they have more information. These are your stats. And then they're like, but we need to talk to our board of directors because they don't really buy this. So we go up to their board of directors and we say, these are your stats, and these are how your competitors are doing. And they're like, now we care. And there's an award ceremony, and the whole media is going to be there. Now we want to be in the picture. We want to be in the newspaper. We want to be the best. So we manage organizational reputation because that's really what they care about. And let me just say, we think the business case is what corporations care about. They don't care. We have developed our own business case with Latin American information. Corporations that have all of our rankings components are 25% more profitable than those corporations that do not have gender equality. And it's causality, it's not correlation. It was done by a university in Colombia that is dedicated to management issues. We brought this business case to Latin America. They don't care. What we need to talk about is reputation. That is what corporations care about. So I know that right here I'm preaching to the choir, we're all gender experts, but what I'm trying to say is whatever we're doing, it is not enough because it is not even finance that these people care about, because if it means giving up their own privilege, it doesn't matter if the numbers are gonna go up. Let's try to bring them to the table in terms of what is in it for you as a person. What is in it for your status? What is in it for your privilege? Yes, we have to give up privilege. What other privileges are we gaining? So it's a very complex conversation that both corporations and the leaders have to get into in terms of understanding where they really want to go.
But it is a powerful insight, Mia, because I've been in many rooms like this where someone will say, well, the business case is clear, and assume that that's enough.
It's fake. They don't really care. They sit on these panels and they just dictate whatever their communications director told them to say, and so the business case. They don't care. You know how I know they don't care? Because when I ask them if they're measuring the business case, 10 years later, after the ranking was implemented in Latin America, they are not measuring how much their profitability has increased after having gender equality. They don't care.
Amazing. Listen, that is a really important insight, because part of what I think Fatima and Asim are hoping we will do as a community is to really think about, well, how do we actually fix these problems? And you're giving us a very clear, actionable point, which is focus on reputation. Name, shame, praise.
Yeah.
But
We don't shame, but we would love for somebody else to do it.
Give us the info. We can do it.
I can tell we're going to have no trouble getting questions from this audience, but I want to alert you, I'm coming to all of you for questions, and I'd love them to be provocative like some of the comments we've already heard. So I'll be coming in just a few minutes. But let's continue the discussion. Maybe, Dorothy, back to you. Your thoughts on what you've heard in general, but in particular, this idea that we are backsliding in many ways, but that the way forward perhaps is to reframe these challenges, to sort of take what's being maybe done to this community through the language you talked about. I know you've talked about issues like gender apartheid as well in your work, but take what's being done to women and girls and sort of reverse it. Use the tricks against them in terms of how we frame these issues, what we say about their reputation, how we describe the roles of women and girls, not as victims, but as peace builders. What are your thoughts about where we go with this?
I mean, I was thinking, listening to Mia, because what the international human rights system has done in a way in all these years since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, in part is naming and shaming countries. So not the private sector, but you have that a level of public reputation and building legitimacy for the way states are acting. And there's studies as to whether the impact on states' reputation has worked. So I think there's something there to be explored further. However, when we see regimes like Afghanistan, and we were there last year, where you have, as we know, the only country in the world where girls and women are prohibited from going to school from 6th grade of primary school onwards, what do you do? Right? So we document that. One way to do, and we have wonderful Afghan women here in the room, Adela, Raz, and possibly others, is placing girls' and women's voices at the center. So this is what we tried to do in the report we prepared on the basis of that visit. Listen to them, listen to their voices. They're saying we are imprisoned in our own homes. It's a backslide. It's a manifestation of the backlash. Probably one of the most extreme ones or the most evident one. But I'm glad you started by the general backlash to say that Afghanistan is not only an isolated case that is happening there. Of course, the most extreme, yes, but we see some of the indicators that we see present there to a lesser degree in other countries. So that's a reason for alarm. But how do we move from maybe what affects countries in their reputation to actually, I was going to say force, not force. I mean, we as human rights mechanisms don't have that power, but persuade them to comply with human rights law, right? How do we do it? One strategy and campaign that the Afghan women and women from other countries are doing is try to raise awareness about this and say we have to name things for what they are. We have to call this institutionalized discrimination against women and girls as gender apartheid. And we're moving to propose that it can be codified as a crime against humanity. And of course, what it already is in human rights law, a grave and systematic human rights violation. But what do we do when we have these extreme examples of gender inequality? And so I think one of the ways is listening to what Afghan women want and are asking for, because they know and they have many creative solutions to propose. So that's one. And the other is for the multilateral system to have a reaction, right? For instance, you know, in the same thing of the development sector, funding women-led, Afghan women-led NGOs, in general, women-led NGOs that are working for these purposes. Sometimes they've changed the names themselves, right? So like in Kabul, in Mazar-e-Sharif, they were telling us, no, so now because the ministry, we can't do gender equality, so we say like for protection of the family. No, but they're doing still education or like clandestine education for the girls to keep on studying and to not lose this generation of girls that 4 years ago, 3.5 years ago, were going to school. Afghan women and men were studying in the university like this together, and now it's only men. So this has to be a moment where the multilateral system draws a red line, right? And so I'm just trying to connect the dots, and I think one of the solutions is human rights law itself. I mean, we've heard today about laws, policies, social norms, changing behaviors. The Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women contains actually obligations in that sense, that states have to change gender stereotypes that place women and girls in a situation of inferiority. And they have to also, in a way, make or create the structures necessary for other actors, including private actors, to change those stereotypes. So this is taken into account in human rights law itself. But of course, that's a treaty that has to be implemented by women's movements. We have to trigger this. We have to allow political space where women's movements can act, because women human rights defenders are under attack, or anyone who defends women's and girls' rights, including men in Afghanistan. We talked with religious leaders, you were saying a while ago. We talked with older men, and it was really impressive for me that men that were like 70, 75 years old, religious leaders in their community, they were saying, this is not the correct interpretation of religion. We are afraid. We are afraid. We feel fear regarding the de facto Taliban authorities. And we have to bring them, yes, into the conversation and to act together, but how to do this? And I don't really have the answer, but I know it can't be done without the Afghan women, that I know for sure, and that we need these networks of solidarity with the other movements. Reasons for hope. We have international instruments that we didn't have when the first Taliban was. We have them now. We have different instruments, International Criminal Court, International Court of Justice that may act upon these measures. This convention that is being discussed on crimes against humanity. And we have a transnational network of women. No? Even the women that are hiding or that are at risk, they are contacting other women. Yep. No? So you have these online connections, digital forms of mobilization that you can build on. So there's not, one size fits all solution, but again, we can't do it without the women, and we can't do it without human rights law. If we are to save something of the international system, it is that.
And it's important to remember, and I've spoken to Afghanis who say, remember that this is a very young country, that most people are young and they never experienced the Taliban before. They experienced education, they experienced social media, they know what's going on in the world. And so don't count them out. Don't forget that there are women who are being really brave. In fact, I was just speaking to an Afghani journalist who says they're reporting independent news, what's happening in Afghanistan, and they're doing it because people are bravely calling up their journalists, their journalists have to sit mostly outside of Afghanistan for safety. But sources inside the country are talking to them, telling them what women and girls are going through, so that story can get out. The other thing I think of when you talk about FGM, it's been in the news a lot about backsliding. And I remember meeting Jaha Dukure. Some of you probably know Jaha, but she was a real force, a real leader. She went through FGM herself, and she helped to create the ban in Gambia, right, her home country. And she did that in part. She told me that she borrowed a car from her uncle, and she drove wherever the president was and just followed him around the country. Wow. She would show up at the backstage of an event like this, just standing up. Remember me? And she did that until eventually she got an audience with him, and she was able to explain and bring religious leaders to the table. And they had this amazing moment where practice was banned. Now it's potentially being reversed, right? Some years later. So I say that because one of the key threads I want to pull out is all of you have talked about, who do we engage with? Who are we actually engaging? That's an important one. And one last point for me, because I want to bring others into the discussion, is about the corollary to what you said, Mia. You said the business case isn't good enough for business leaders. Well, then the corollary would be the economic case isn't good enough for political leaders, right? It's not enough to say, look, your economy is going to grow. More women should be in the workforce. Help us. We need to find those pressure points that actually move political leaders. Okay, I want to hear from all of you more in a second, but let me see how many hands there are for questions or comments. Okay, we have a lot. Let's hear from all of you. We'll come back to the panel. If we can go around with a microphone, we'll take 3 at least to start. If you can try to keep them short-ish and tell us who you are, that would be really helpful. There's one over here in the front. We can start here. Go to you next, and we'll go to this gentleman in the front. We'll come back, I promise. Please.
Okay, my name is Aisha O, and I'm the CEO of the Murtala Muhammad Foundation. So for me, the question it's a question, it's a comment, it's a combination of both, is that we find that sometimes we take 5 steps forward and then we take 10 steps backward. So how do we bridge that gap? And I'll just give you a very simple, story, a narrative. Most of you remember the hashtag Bring Back Our Girls 10 years ago. So now a lot of the Chibok girls are back. We still have 90 in captivity. We released a report a month ago. 21 girls came back with 34 children of the Chibok girls. Some of these girls were abducted when they were 13. So you can imagine a situation where we have some of the worst education indices in Nigeria. 20 million children out of school. Most of them are in northern Nigeria. We're trying to keep the children in school. So there are lots of policies, and that's what I'm talking about. Many steps going forward, trying to keep girls in school, trying to make sure that the parents. Then we have that abduction. Since Chibok, we've had 1,700 school children abducted in 38 schools, in 10 years. And on top of it, we've got this whole issue around statutory rape. We've got forced marriage. We've got girls coming back with children. We've got governments actively trying to appease terrorists by allowing them to keep their abducted wives. I don't have any answers, but I thought I'd share that with you.
Well, I thank you for raising it because we want to hear the context, right? And this is the real context for many people. We have the next question there. Yes.
Thank you. Hi, Ana Hierro from Mexico. Well, in Mexico, as in most countries, 30% of our economy is supported, or the care economy accounts for about 30% of our GDP.
Wow.
But it's not accounted for really, as you know. And as you said, when business incorporate women, efficiency goes up incredibly rapidly. And if that doesn't matter, and if elections are won on emotion and security issues mainly, I'm wondering if the networking between women makes a difference in comparison to how men network, and whether or not that can be a powerful tool to make these things become relevant. The Prime Minister before said, like, when I come to a room and it's full of men and I say women are important, then they just look at each other and say, like, why? And these men usually, I'm sorry, I'm going to try to make it brief, they hang out in, sports clubs, or they go for drinks at night or whatever, and women, we usually don't. Because, as you said, or someone said before, we have 5 different trips and we have to take care of our children and go to school or whatever. And so how do we make this kind of networks? And I think that's something that could influence things. In Mexico, we had, before the pandemic, a really huge movement. And the economy stopped for a day. I mean, women stopped going to work for a day. And it really changed the narrative. But then COVID happened and everything stopped. So we need to, we were taken back to our homes and we couldn't do networking. So what I'm trying to ask to you is, do you think that cross-sectoral networking could help? And if so, my invitation would be for this kind of forum to be a platform for that kind of, work. And how do we build upon experiences to strengthen policy? Thank you.
Thank you. And we can bring the mic right here to the front, please.
Greetings. My name is Juni Sagalon from Sierra Leone. I serve as Director General for Youth Association in Sierra Leone and also serve as Chief Executive for Junior Investments Company. So I've got 2 questions. On the non-profit aspect, what component can be put together as a structural instrument that can serve as a universal language for women to see that they can enable themselves going forward in making necessary change in the various sectors we've talked about? Because we've seen so many language, so many instruments, but the effectiveness of this instrument is still at play. We had the opportunity with the COVID-19, which is a negative one, but it's a reset button. But yet still, we see how diversified and, excuse my language, how cocky everybody's getting. That's why you can't even have the leaders who are causing trouble nowadays to even listen to anybody. Everybody's acting up. And in the African region where I'm coming from, we see level of instability. But nobody has really looked at the issue. Why somebody who you're talking to has got proper hearing but it's not listening to what you're saying? And I'm happy with the point she brought to the table. On a corporate side, what instrument can we use to see that women should support themselves, come what may, to build a sustainable economic or ecosystem that empower them in the socioeconomic climate that we find ourselves. We see that in as much as it's a competitive world, as a private sector, you need to be at the top of your profit gain. I don't need to strangulate your business as a woman. How many times have we seen women come together? If one corporation is collapsing that is owned by a woman, a cooperative of women are coming to put that establishment back up. If it is an economic vehicle in a particular member state, what language are we having for our women? And perhaps the third would be for our young ones coming up. We are confused, that I can tell you, because we have so many variables being thrown at us. And with social media being one of the best tools that we use to teach ourselves, there's no way forward for a viable, sustainable journey for the young girls. That's the honest truth. Because if they have to establish themselves, we have cultural norms to abide to. We have socioeconomic norms to abide to. We have what we're being taught at school. And we have this generic way of communicating through social media. We have people who are very active on social media, but they can't even talk close to each other. These are barriers that have been established. How can you break those norms that can empower them to be the positive change we need to see in society for women? Because if our sisters and our mothers coming up don't have the right notion, I'm guaranteeing you the next generation after mine, they're in trouble. Already we have AI coming up. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Janice. And maybe we'll just pass the mic to your table mate here for a quick question too, please.
So I have a quick comment and question. I loved your point about, I'm Ellen Snee. I've worked in corporations advancing women for 25 years, and I'm now on the leadership board of the Women in Public Policy. When you were saying that companies don't care about the business case, been there, done that. When you said they care about their reputation, yes, I agree. And the other thing I've found is the companies with a lot of white men at the top really are competitive. So a really impactful thing in working in a company is to point out how one of their peers is advancing something, and then the sky is the limit about what you can do. So my question is, I have observed in the last maybe 10 years, a newer generation of young men rising in companies of every race and background and marital, non-marital status. And it has felt to me like the narrative that I would talk about gender inequality for so long is shifting. And I'm just curious if you're finding anything in your experience around shifts with younger men who I think the key factor is having seen their daughters be born. And I think there's a story there. And so I'd just like to hear what you think.
Thank you so much, Ellen. Okay, so maybe, Vineta, can I start with you? I want to piece together two things we heard from Janisa and Aisha. They both talked about, well, in Sierra Leone, the West Africa region, Nigeria, their neighbor, there's a lot of instability. We've had 7 coups in the Sahel region in the last 18 months or so. There's the situation of abduction. And there's a sense of what do we do given that context, that kind of backsliding? This is your remit, right? This is what you get up every morning and have to try to address. How do you think about that?
I think it's very much linked to what have been said here, the issue of the women's movement as well. In terms of the transformation to be together to fight against something. You know, the adoption of the girls, for us to work with the women of Nigeria and making sure that, you know, whatever has happened in the, on the Chibok girls, that we are able to bring it out there. Because sometimes they are just putting it under the carpet. When it started, for example, in Nigeria, we used the film industries. The AU was saying that there was no adoption of girl in Nigeria. I went myself with the filmmaker and I met with those who escaped and with the mothers, use the media and bring it to the AU Peace and Security Council to the ambassador. They said, listen, this is what is happening. And you are in denial. You are saying that it didn't happen. So now this woman is not lying, the one that I took the film. So we need to build alliances. I could not do it if I didn't meet the women in Nigeria who opened the door for me, fly into the region, get the people, talk to them, and bring it out there and name and shame. And say that something needs to be done by the government of Nigeria, but also the international community. Because this is an issue that affects all of us. If a girl is kidnapped in my country, it should affect all of us. Mm-hmm. That's the thing. We are in a global village. Whatever is happening somewhere needs, to be questioned in Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone was in conflict, the Manu River. Liberia, Sierra Leone, Guinea was going into war. Three of you were just, killing one another. But what the women did in that region, and it come to the issue is when women come together, how they can transform? It's the Manu River women who came together. Maybe you were not born that time. Went to meet with their president, went to meet with the other president, and people were saying, but you are fighting, 3 countries fighting. How can you have a common agenda as 3 countries fighting? How can the 2 president countries or 3 are fighting, but you have a common agenda together? The issue is how, as a global, we are looking at an issue that affects us. What united them was the fact they are all suffering. Liberia was suffering, Sierra Leone was suffering, the kidnapping was there was no peace. So if there is no peace, no education, no health, the women get together on a common agenda, travel all around the Manu River and say to them, you need to stop it because we need education, we need finance, this is what we need. And that's why I'm saying when women unite on a common agenda, we are able to make sure that things transform. The issue is how do we get that common agenda among ourselves?
Yeah.
How do we make sure that we are united on something? I'm not saying that we are an homogeneous group. No, at all. But we can discuss one issues that affect all of us, affect our community, that we are able to use that and make that difference that I wanted to see. Let me just, I just wanted to one of my area, which is women, peace, and security. Everybody say women have to be at the table of negotiation. They are not. We talk about they are victims. The Minister of Cote d'Ivoire said about it. But how do we make sure that they are there? When we are fighting, we invite those men and young boys that have the guns and invest on them. Mm-hmm. That's the reality right now. And we want women to lead negotiation. How do we do it? We need to fight for it. We need to make sure, for example, that the mediators that is going, or even the leader mandate, have a gender agenda in his mandate. We need to make sure, in many cases, for example, Mandela, with whom I have worked with, on the Burundi case and others, he will call for the women to come at the table. It doesn't happen automatically.
Yeah, I think
how the investors as well, because here we're talking about internationally. We all invest in mediation, but we invest on those who hold the guns. Even when we come to the politicians, how do we name and shame also partners to say, invest on the women if you believe on the women can make a difference? So it's a collective responsibility. It's United Nations, it's the African Union, but the women movement are more and more organized. What we need is that political will and make sure that we dismantle this ecosystem that is controlled by men and make sure that we bring the women agenda at the front, because that's the sustainability. It has been proven evidence that the sustainability of the agreement and any accord in Africa and elsewhere.
Let's stay on this point from our colleague from Mexico. I'm sorry I didn't get your name, but it's an interesting point. I mean, if you think about half the world are women and girls. So, you know, if there are powerful male networks, can't there be equally powerful female networks? Whether it's in business, whether it's workers, whether it's publics, voters, women who are building peace in their communities. So I think, Benita, what you began discussing there is a key central theme. Like, how does this community take its work? It's so global. It's representative of so many kinds of women-led organizations. How does it take its work and build the counter movement to the backlash and create real political power? How do any of the three of you see it?
Janet.
Okay, sure. I'll go. Very difficult question. Yeah, I mean, that definitely resonates with me, needing to build networks among women and, you know, just even across the different diversity, how do we think about what are the common agenda issues that women should be working on together with each other on different continents, across different sectors, right? Collaboration is so important, and this is a world that is, you know, increasingly not collaborating. Conflict is, we're rife with conflict. A lot of them are intractable, and you know, sometimes women are not involved in the conversation. But you know, in terms of the private sector, which is my realm, you know, there is a small group of senior women. So of course, I'm not so proud to say that in Asia, only 6% of CEOs are women. You know, CFOs are C-suite is increasingly women, but it's not like the West. In Europe and America, we have a long way to go. You know, there's a very small percentage of venture funding that's going to women entrepreneurs, and as we know, you know, that is a job generator, right? Entrepreneurship. So there is a lot of opportunities for women in business and in private sector to come together and mentor each other and reverse mentor. You know, sometimes it's younger women mentoring older women who might be more traditional and cannot break through social norms and gender barriers. And that there needs to be women who are coming up with, and there are, you know, women-centric venture capital funds that are supporting you know, women entrepreneurs. And if you talk about places like the Philippines and Indonesia, you know, again, girls, women, they are attaining high levels of education, just like males. However, if you talk to the venture capitalists, you know, if you're talking to a male, they can you know, come up with a pretty decent business and easily get capital. But then, you know, an Indonesian woman I've talked to who have started 5 companies, a serial entrepreneur, is saying how difficult it is to get the funding for her business. So there is an opportunity across regions. You know, maybe somebody is feeling alone in a particular country, but that's a problem that if you're in Vietnam, you're in Indonesia, maybe you're somewhere in Africa, there are female entrepreneurs who are facing very similar problems. So, you know, there would be an opportunity, I think, for people to have the conversation. You know, the Kennedy School is a great place to convene. You know, hope that Women in Public Policy program led by Iris and you know, certainly the CID would be a place to convene more women to have cross-sector conversations, right? We know that, you know, the problems go from, we talk about maternity leave, right? Women dropping off because they don't have, there's no paternity leave or not enough maternity support. But it actually goes all the way through a woman's career. Later on in their lives, while they are more senior, they have to take care of their elderly parents. And of course, in my region, Asia is aging very quickly. Even a country like India, actually by 2050, India will have a higher share of population that is over the age of 65 than China, which we know is aging. And we think India is a young country. So in 25 years, we'll have to deal with you know, taking care of elderly relatives and family while women are still building their careers. So support for each other is so important.
Yeah, that's a great point, that women in those societies that are aging find themselves having to take care of their parents and their children at the same time. Right, so the burden is getting bigger. I want to come to the two of you too, but we have just a couple of minutes, and I know a couple more hands were up. Can we do 2 rapid fire ones? Right here and right there. Wait for the microphone to come to you. so our live stream audience can hear what you have to say.
Okay.
Right over there. Yes, right here. And if you can keep it brief, please. We're very tight on time.
I mean, it seemed to me that a theme that has recurred in every session today is that we are living in a world of increasing threat. You know, we in Europe have Putin. You know, you've just referred over and over again to the problems that America is facing, and South America and Africa. And it seems to me that, you know, when people are threatened, you know, they want a simple solution. And I think, you know, there's at least a theory contested that men's brains are wired from front to back, so that if there's a problem, they immediately think of action, and that may explain why all these strong men are rising up. But I think that women, their brains are much more wired side to side. They think of all the implications. And I think that appreciation of complexity is fantastic, but it can also bog us down. And it seems to me, I so agree, you know, that we have to start somewhere, and put up with the imperfection. And I think once we do that, once you get started, you have the psychology of small wins. Something that didn't occur to you now suddenly is on the horizon because it's been revealed. That's the way I think we need to proceed.
Thank you. We can just get the mic over here to this gentleman. Oh,
I have with
oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Okay. Yes. Yeah. We'll take one there, and then we'll come back over here. Go ahead. I'm so sorry. We're so tight on time. I would love to keep it going. And wait for the mic, please, so the live stream audience can hear you.
I really appreciate your comments, and I thank you for them. 2 points. One is, Janet, on your point of, you know, the number of women in the workforce, right? And looking at it from a percentage perspective, in your example about manufacturing, right, and how more women are in there. How do you, even from a capitalist lens, right, ensure that the number is not just reflective of women's equality, but that those jobs, including the manufacturing jobs, which we know are not, you know, well-paying jobs, they're not good condition jobs, so that the jobs that women are stepping into are actually good jobs, right? And so it's not just about the number of women participating, but it's what kind of quality jobs are being created for those women. And so I'd love to hear how, you know, you are dealing with that. And the second question is, Mia, I love you. And I love the fact that you're approaching your work in a name and shame way, but from the inside. And the one thing that strikes me is that, you know, having worked in this movement for over 25 years, policy papers and research don't create change and definitely don't create revolutions. I hate to say that to all the academics in the room. I'm really sorry. But you know what does? Campaigning, right? And so it's really about grassroots activism and empowering those people, right, in allowing for change that may come up through ideas here to actually do the work. So how are you guys bridging, you know, the work that you're doing, which is sort of on the inside, with outside groups?
Thank you so much. We'll take one last one here. Oh,
I'm here with
sorry. Okay, we'll take yours. I apologize. If I had more time, I would take it. Go ahead.
Thanks to the panelists. This is a really important discussion. You both mentioned, I think several of you mentioned childcare. You mentioned taking care of the aged. We heard about grandmothers taking about children. But we haven't taken into account that we have several movements working on unpaid care, childcare, gender equality, women economic empowerment. But we speak at cross purposes, and we are yet to convince the governments to actually bring about the system change that we want, to make sure that women are remunerated, they are recognized for the unpaid care work that they do,
that they are able to increase, we are able to increase the female labor participation. Lack of childcare is very much at the center of that. And then perhaps taking a systems thinking perspective to mutually understanding the interconnectedness of the ecosystem, and then figuring out where are the levers that we can all work on to get the policy change we need, to get the tax credits we want for women, to make childcare affordable of high quality so that children can thrive. So my question to you and to all of you in this room, and also to the Center for International Development, as well as the Women and Public Policy Program, what is the dialogue we should be having, and what is the political commitment we should be building, both for private sector and for governments, and that we all speak the same language together?
Thank you so much. And we are nearly out of time, believe it or not. So I'm going to ask our panelists to just give us a final thought, and you can pick up on many of the themes we picked up in the questions, whatever you'd like to. And maybe I can start with you, Dorothy, and perhaps on this, I mean, you can take what you want to take, but this issue of, how do we actually make change, right? Is it a campaigning mentality that everyone in this room needs to go into a campaign mode? Of course, there are a lot of people doing different things. People are doing research, they're doing policy. What do we actually do as a community?
Mm-hmm. So networking, I'm from Mexico, so we can network later. And in Mexico, we say that the good ones, we are more, but the bad ones are better organized. Yeah. So let's get organized, let's speak up, let's defend human rights on 3 main points: reputation of private and public actors, human rights and feminist-centered approaches to all laws, public policies, and efforts to change behavior, all human rights, civil and political, but also economic, social, and cultural, and human right to development, and to break the glass ceiling, but also the class ceiling. And 3, accountability for those violations and where to draw the red lines and stand together to uphold human rights and gender equality.
Our colleague spoke about, Mia, the psychology of small wins. And I think about the work you're doing is very much along those lines. Maybe they're big wins, but you're showing what's possible, right? You're showing, hey, these companies can do things, you can too. What are some final thoughts for you about how we take this energy and bring it forward?
I'm with Dorothy 100%. I think we have to stop working in silos. This is the first time I have been invited to an event that is on development. I am always in corporate events, and I think that if we continue working that way, we're not going to get anywhere. I think that we are facing a very aggressive backlash, and I think that we need to get serious about it. So I would suggest that this room becomes a platform in terms of advancing these topics together. And what I would say basically is we need to give women money and power. Whenever you are anywhere where you can give women money or power, just give it to them, and just get the gender lens there, because sometimes there are also women that have money and power and then they don't do nothing that is feminist-like, and then you're back in the beginning. So let's do money and power and feminism together every time that we can, and not in silos.
Thank you so much. Janet, our representative of that side of the room made an important point.
Yes, certainly.
Around quality of jobs, not just number of jobs.
And I think that certainly when we talk about gender equality, we have to talk about quality, and that's really important. And I think that's where international cooperation comes in. So when we're talking about trade and exports, what we're going to see over the next 2 years is that Europe in particular is going to come up with more stringent regulations in terms of sustainability, in terms of due diligence. And this is a way to not race to the bottom, but race to the top. And that, I think, is my hope, that it will be influential in positive influence on getting more gainful employment for women, especially as women get better educated in my region, that they are going to get more decent jobs. And of course, these conversations, I very much agree, need to continue not in silos, but we need to be open-minded. And I also am talking a lot with corporate audiences. So it's wonderful to learn from all of you and hear about how developed countries can collaborate more to advance an inclusive economy for all.
Thank you. And Vineta, a final thought for you. They're giving us the hook, but let us know what you think.
Women leadership matters. And for us, we have created what we call the Africa Women Leaders Network, from head of state, prime minister, but to the grassroots women, because they are also leaders in their community, like Mama. And the Africa Women Leaders Network, some of them are here in the room. I see BC, my sister who created the Africa Women Development Fund. But what we do, and both of you and Madam Minister, but one of the things we're doing is the intergenerational dialogue among us. We have done our work. So now we have to give the baton to the next generation. So we close our doors. We share our experience, what we have done in our house. Ellen Johnson did it the last time, BC, on how she created the fund. Many of us, the minister, to say how we create this new generation of young women who can learn from us, our experience, but the expertise they have, because the young people, they have the knowledge and the expertise. So this intergenerational dialogue is something that we are promoting within the Africa Women Leaders Network. The next one will be in Côte d'Ivoire. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I will just leave you with this, because I will not try to summarize this incredible panel and all the rich discussion you had. I would just say that the backsliding is real, but it is not inevitable, right? That this room, the people in this room and the people on the stage are working every day in their own ways to stop it. And I think we heard some really important points about how we can do that. So it's real, but it's not inevitable. And in fact, we are leaving this session to go and talk about solutions in the incubator room. So it's a perfect segue for that discussion. Please join me in thanking this fabulous panel.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.